Today, we are joined by Rob Williams. Rob is a historian at the Army University Press and author of the newly released The Airborne Mafia, which explores how a small group of World War II airborne officers took control of the U.S. Army after World War II and shaped Cold War policy. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button and comment your thoughts down below. Enjoy the episode. I would like to ask a question, sort of off topic, very broad, but not really. And I'm trying to start all of my episodes with this question. I believe it's a very important question, one that I grapple with every day, and that is, why do you think it's important to study history?
Well, I think it's important to study history so we can understand the present
Mhm.
moment, right? History is nothing but the the story of the past, and by studying the past and trying to get a more holistic understanding of everything that came before, we can better understand the present, because the present is nothing but you know the accumulated past leading up
Mhm.
to today. So I think it's important so we can understand the present moment that we're in whatever context that may be,
Right.
whether you're a political historian, military historian, social historian, whatever it might be. It can all be kind of woven together to more holistically kind of understand where we are today.
Yeah. I mean, it's the story of ourselves, right? I mean, this is something, one of my most passionate focuses. I'm a very patriotic guy, as you can tell. And when I look at especially fellow young men my age, I see a lack of drive, a lack of purpose, and a lack of pride. I mean, I feel like back in the day, men had pride in their country, young men, they answered the call of duty to fight. Like, there's sort of a crisis boiling underneath the surface with young men nowadays, and that's one of the reasons I started this podcast, is I feel sort of obligated by my ancestors to tell their stories.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of my studies has been into masculinity, right, and all that. And it seems to me there's always a crisis in masculinity, right?
Really.
Every era is always harkening back to a past era when men were men,
Mhm.
and every era, I could find you a news article from every decade, probably every year, talking about how people don't want to work anymore, or men lack drive and purpose and these sort of things. And it's really interesting to me because
Wow.
you see it and you hear about it today, right? But
Yeah.
in the 1950s, for example, there was a giant crisis in masculinity,
Mm.
and people were harkening back to the Western, right, to the old West, right. And so you see all these westerns in the
Yeah.
50s, and all this sort of like this is sort of the golden era of American history. And one of my favorite articles from, I think it's Harper's. Oh gosh, I'd have to find it. It's a primary source I've used in the past, but it's right on the eve of U.S. entry into World War II, talking about, oh my goodness, we're weak, we're going to fail in this war. There's no way we can fight this war because we're so weak. These tough fascists over in Germany are going to roll right through us. Well, as we know, that's not the case. That's not what happened. So, no, it's interesting you say that, because it's something I think about as well. Right? Is how do we, how does societies interpret the past, and how do and why is that sort of seemingly kind of continuous, right? It's
Yeah.
just, it's one of those nebulous. It's so crazy. Anyway, sorry,
It no, no, no,
tangent.
no. It is so interesting because, I mean, my sort of solution to that is through history, sort of my interests and my passion. I'm a big history buff, and I sort of found, I wouldn't say that comfort, but the answer in history, and learning about exactly what you said, how we got to the present, who we are, the people and the stories and the events that shaped not just where we are, um, as a nation, or in the world, and the world order and the dynamics, geopolitics and all that, but as who we are as people. The things we do day to day, 95% of our habits and the sort of things we do day to day are just kind of the status quo carried on from generations, and habits that have been passed down from our parents.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're talking about is sort of cultural ideas, which kind of might be a good segue if you want to talking about the book. It's the habits, established norms, values, right, and beliefs
Yeah.
that groups and to look more at the book as the groups pick up, right,
Yeah.
and kind of operate along, right, kind of establish organizational cultures, and we can extrapolate that sort of to larger scale, for the nation state, and so this is the culture of whatever town you're from or I'm from and
Yes.
everything like that. But in the book, I talk about this specifically in regard to parachute units, mostly parachute infantry units in World War II, and that's interesting you mentioned that
Yeah,
because yeah,
no. It is sort of a beautiful tie-in to the book because it's especially prevalent in military culture. I had on, Major General Jason Bohm, who was a, Marine Corps Major General. So, obviously, in the Marine Corps, there's a lot of rich, historical traditions and, very, I don't know, I guess traditional is the word. There's a lot of stuff that they pass down. Like, he was talking about, the birthday of the Marine Corps is a really big deal. And no matter where they are in the world, if they're on the battlefield in the jungles of Guadalcanal or they're at home off duty, they always celebrate the birthday of the Marine Corps. And even if they're in the jungle, they'll get their little, military meals and they'll have like a little pound cake and they'll divide it and pass it around and celebrate. But just to linger on this a little bit more, you mentioned earlier, this is a really interesting point, how um every generation has their own sort of crisis harkening back to the past. Like, oh, the past generation was the golden age, and every generation has that because it's true. Have you ever seen the movie Midnight in Paris with Owen Wilson?
I can't say that I have. I'm
It's
sorry.
it's a beautiful movie, but it's 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 this Owen Wilson plays this writer, and he's it's takes place sort of in modern day, and he's fascinated with 1950s Paris. Like, that's his golden age, prior generation. And something happens in the movie where he's able to basically travel back in time to the 1950s in Paris, or maybe it's the 1920s. Yeah, it's the 1920s in Paris. And he's hanging out with Hemingway and, the guy who wrote Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald. He's hanging out with his idols, his icons, and he's like, "Wow, I'm in it. I'm in the goal. I'm hanging out with my heroes." And he meets this girl in the 1920s, and they're hanging out and they're connecting because he's having his marital problems. He doesn't really like his wife. She doesn't support his writing venture. Um, so they end up traveling even further back in time to, I believe, the 1880s. And she is like, oh, this is the golden age. And she wants to stay there, but he wants to stay in the 1920s because of that generational difference. So it's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, there's always this nostalgia for right for the
Yeah.
past, right, and I think a lot of it has to do with some when we look to the past, we tend to look at what we want to look at, right? And
Yeah.
instead of trying to uncover the whole truth, I could anyway. I think that there's some danger in nostalgia, right?
Yeah, for
In
sure.
that, and that's hopefully what historians try to do is help shine a light and to give us a more like that's why I say a more holistic understanding,
Yeah.
right? Peel back the layers and try to understand more of what about what's going on, not just whatever it is that might be
Yeah.
enticing.
Not just looking at history through the rose colored glasses. That's
Right?
for understand. I
Yeah.
mean,
I mean,
I know I fall victim to this, very heavily because I'm an '80s kid all the way. Like, if I wish I lived through the '80s as, a young person, a teenager, like, the way I dress, the listen to music to, it's all '80s. So yeah, it is a very interesting cultural phenomenon.
well, and I was a teenager in the '90s, and so I look back on the '90s really, really well, right? With nostalgia, right?
Yeah,
And it's just it's almost a natural human phenomenon
it is, yeah.
because I think of like if you lose somebody, right? If somebody important to you died old age or young, whatever, we tell each other, we specifically tell each other, hey, remember the good, right? Focus on that
Uh-huh.
and honor that memory and all that. And boom, I think that is a natural human thing that then when it's applied to sort of thinking broadly about the
Yeah.
past is kind of where we get that from. I think. I mean, this is me pontificating. You know, uh, I'm a soapbox right now, but it is fun to think about though for sure.
It
No,
is.
absolutely.
It is interesting. So let's talk about, this history, particularly your area of expertise, the Airborne Mafia, which is your new book. So, when and why did you decide to write this book? What was sort of the decision making process behind, I actually want to tell these people's stories?
Yeah. Well, I was in the military I had a career in the military, and and I remember. Well, okay. So I get out and I go to college. I'm the undergrad that's in my 30s, right? That yeah. I mean, it is what it is. I'll use the GI Bill, having a good time. Clearly the older dude. I tried to color my beard
Mm.
with just for men. Yeah, it looked even more. Looked worse, right? But it is what it is. And I have to write, as you do, right, in a history class. And in one class, I was encouraged to write about military innovations in warfare,
Mm.
and one pre-gunpowder and one post-gunpowder, right? So
Oh.
there was this broad history of war class, a fantastic class. We joke in the field now, it's like a Plato to NATO is sort of right, like that. That's that broad of a class. Um, but so for the uh, post gunpowder innovation, I chose to write about vertical envelopment because had been in the airborne, and so that went swimmingly. Right, it looks like a 10-page paper, which looking back on it, like at the time seemed like a monumental undertaking,
Yeah, yeah.
and now seems really
Tri
like no big deal.
trivial.
Yeah, right. It's just it's funny how perspective changes too, right?
Yeah.
But and so that went well, and then I started to think about graduate school, and I started to think about culture, because I was encouraged to write another paper, more of a senior thesis, like half of a senior thesis sort of thing. And that I remembered this Army Times article. And for any of the listeners who don't know the Army Times, it's part of the military times, right? Each service has their own, and it's basically like the National Enquirer, but for the military, right? To harken back, it might even be a '90s-ism at this point, but um, I don't even know if it's in film print. But anyway, because it'd be in the checkout at like the gas station that was called the Shopette on base, the little gas station, right? And it would have your headlines, and for a while you could flip through it, but then after a while, they realized everyone was flipping through it and not buying it, so they put it in plastic, so you had to buy it, and then in order to open it, right? And it was like 350, I think, and it come out every Monday. And I remember I was in there getting my monster or whatever, right? And it was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and on the cover it said, "Does the Army even need airborne?" Because I was a member of the 82nd Airborne Division, and you could hear the entire base just right, groaning like this is nonsense. What the heck? And so I'm writing this paper, and I remember this article, so I went and looked it up. And the article actually came from an academic study done at the part of the Army where I work now about, kind of, all right, let's look at World War II. Like, was it actually feasible? Was it worth it? Kind of like, were they successful? And he looked at the Brits and the US and the Soviets, and then how they then formed their forces in the Cold War.
Mhm.
And so I used that for the article, but when it came to writing the dissertation and I wanted to get after, the airborne and the culture behind it, what made it unique and different, because I had lived that. I had
Yeah.
gone from a non-airborne unit to an airborne unit, early in my career, and I was like, oh, something different here. And so that sort of was the impetus behind what was the dissertation and now the book. So, it was kind of wanting to, I love jumping out of airplanes, and I kind of wanted to understand why it still existed and why like it grabbed me the way it did, and all that culture. I wanted to start, I wanted to write like a more about like why, kind of a bottom up history, and about soldiers and NCOs and singing cadences and all that stuff. But the sources sort of led me down the path to where it is now, which is fairly top down, right? Mid-level army management, major generals, colonels, and the like, and of course chiefs of staff because they become chiefs of staff. But yeah, that's sort of the story on that.
That's funny. I'll leave the jumping out of planes to you. I'll pass on that. I'm sure you've jumped out of enough planes for the both of us. But it's interesting because this is your lived experience as you're writing this book. It's not just you're analyzing it as a historian. You actually lived through the sort of the principles and the culture that you're talking about. But I mean, let's linger on that a little bit. So you were in the 82nd Airborne, you said? So I mean, what was that experience like? Why did you end up joining the airborne divisions, and what was that experience like?
Well, so I started off, and my first unit was at Fort Lewis, which is 2 hours from home. I grew up in Washington State, and which is great. I'm 18 years old. Like, I can go home on the weekend. It's super.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
great. Very very rare for the Army. And then I was always kind of drawn. I went to airborne school as a brand new private, but ended up in a non-airborne unit. We fielded the new Strikers in 2001, and I deployed with them to Iraq. It was great, great unit, great friends, like absolutely fantastic experience. But I kind of wanted to try something different, test myself a little bit.
Mm.
So I ended up reenlisting, and I went to the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Italy,
Oh.
which was, I mean, can't beat that, right? The
Is
Army's
that
going to
is
pay
that
me.
is that where you get the title Mafia from?
No, no, no. I got the
No, I
mafia
I know, I know,
title. Yeah, yeah. I saw within the sources, sort of, and other people have written about him that way. But no, I went to Italy, and then now, okay, oh wow, this is different, right?
yeah.
It's a different unit here, different mindset. They really think highly of themselves. And I started to read airborne history there. A friend of mine gifted me a copy of a book called Airborne. Uh, E.M. Flanagan, who is a retired major general who served with the 11th in the Pacific, wrote a history of the 11th, wrote this big history of American Airborne. I think it's called A Combat Chronicle of blah, 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 is the subtitle. But that was sort of formative, right? And then from there, I basically stayed in airborne units. Went to the schoolhouse at Fort Benning and was down there. Then I went up to Alaska and was served in the airborne in Alaska, the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, and then I say finally, but I finally went to the quote unquote mothership, as they call it, the 82nd Airborne Division,
Mm,
and then served out the remainder of my time in the Army there. So served in three different major airborne units and
yeah.
jumped all over the place. So yeah, it
That
was a lot of and I loved it. I was ready. I was a jump master, ready to do all the jumpy things.
that's incredible. Well, thank you for your service, first of
Oh
all.
no, appreciate it.
But, do you still like skydiving and jumping out of airplanes? You still do it?
No, I don't. I haven't. I never got into skydiving. I mean, I would jump again, but I think that after I became a jump master, the best part was being in charge of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And you know what I mean? And that feel, having the responsibility and taking care of, you might get some young soldier that's, on their sixth, seventh, eighth jump and they're scared, and making sure they're fine, right? Like there's something beautiful about that. Um, like, nah, you're gonna be fine, dude. You're good. Like a little grin, uh, can go a long way on a
Yeah,
stressful aircraft.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, that was the best part. And so I mean, my body, my back hurts, my knees hurt, you know what I mean? Like all that
Yeah,
stuff. I that was fine. That was a part of my life, and I'm good. But I still, and it's funny, I'm scared of heights.
yeah.
Yeah, because I don't have a parachute,
That's true,
right?
yeah, yeah.
But then there's other little things like flying on an airplane that makes me think of it. But that's, memories. You know how the
Right,
brain the
yeah,
brain's
yeah.
funny like that.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so your title, Airborne Mafia, is quite interesting. You didn't get it because you were stationed in Italy, uh, probably experiencing the mafia a little bit. So what is this title, Airborne Mafia? What are you implying behind that? Because it's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, no, because after World War II, the major airborne officers from the war, right, rise to the top, because of their fame and because of their ability to use the press, and they sort of control the army and look out for each other like a
Oh,
mafia does. And the way the army develops during that period, by and large, is a direct product of the culture that they inculcated their units with during the war, and that they kind of sort of carried then to the rest of the army.
mm,
And so, yeah, they're more or less a mafia. And then I have to look. I got the book right here, of course. The definition of mafia fits really well. I have it in the introduction here. I could find it. But anyway, the point being, these men, come to control the army, and and take care of each other like a mafia would.
Yeah.
So you go ahead. I'm gonna keep looking.
Yeah, it's not just a the mafia. It's not just a crime family. It's sort of a it's sort of a cadre of individuals who are looking out for each other, um, drafting sort of policies, I guess, that would be beneficial to themselves. But sort of in broad terms, just so we can have an idea of this going forward, in case anyone may be unfamiliar, um, what exactly do airborne divisions of the Army do? Like, what is their role within the Army?
Yeah, okay, great. So we have the United States Army today has one. You talking about today or in the 40s?
We'll go with today, and then we'll go to the back to the origins after.
Sure, sure. Yeah. So today, the Army has one airborne division and two brigades, one in Italy and one in Alaska. And let me backtrack. And then you have the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell.
Mhm.
And then really in Alaska, it's named the 11th Airborne Division, but one brigade out of the two are on jump status. And this is where I get a little bit away from myself here. I like to think of airborne as more than just jumping
Yeah.
parachutes, but we tend to, and I just was a victim of my own thing I'm trying to eradicate, is thinking of just parachutes when we say airborne, right? And so, but it's not that. It's more than that, right? It's definitely, to me, it's really anything, moving troops through the air, be it by helicopter or in the 40s glider, parachute, now helicopters, or any other thing that might be invented. Certainly airplanes that and so on. But so now the major role is to move quickly to seize and hold ground, and most often the 82nd practices that in the form of airfield seizures to snag an airfield and control it and run it to then bring in airplanes that land and bring in more combat power
Mm,
and expand their lodgement from there, and to do whatever U.S. Whatever U.S. national interests called them to do.
right.
And then very similar in World War II. I mean, in the 40s it was a similar mission. They kind of started, with the idea of smaller units, sabotage kind of stuff, right? Send them behind enemy lines
Mm,
to do that sort of thing. But it kind of grew to larger operations, and they sort of assumed, and airborne units today as well, a role kind of like the old school um, cavalry, right?
mhm.
And especially in World War II, they're doing cavalry type missions and screening in front of friendly forces, jumping in front of friendly forces to screen from enemy counterattack. Normandy being in Sicily being pretty prominent examples. Deep penetration raids, Market Garden kind of fits that mold
Yeah.
to a degree, or the 101st in and the famous left hook, right, in Desert Storm, right, kind of fits that mold. But 100 some odd years before that, that would have been people on horses, right, doing the
Yeah.
same idea. So they kind of fit that mold in World War II, more like a strategic cavalry sort of idea. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the role. Sorry, long-winded again. I tend to
No,
do
no,
that
no, it's good.
as we historians do. It's a trait.
Yeah, it's
I
good.
think we learn it in grad school to
Right.
just ramble.
No, I love it. Yeah, so let's go back to the origins. This is interesting because I had never had any sort of concept of this until I actually watched Band of Brothers, which I'm sure you've seen and are familiar with. So the airborne divisions were created sort of in the build up to U.S. involvement in World War II. Can you walk me through uh, the decision making behind that, sort of the necessity for airborne units?
Sure. Yeah. So we'll go back even further. In 1918, Billy Mitchell of the United States Army Air Corps proposes the idea of dropping the First Infantry Division with parachutes from 1918 era bomber wings behind enemy lines to get around the trenches in World War One. Trench warfare in World War One really, inspires a lot of innovation that in maneuver that you see in World War Two. A lot of the technology is pretty much the same, and by the end of World War One, a lot of the maneuver ideas are the same stuff we see later in World War II.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where it to me it's sort of born from the idea of like trench warfare sucks. Like how do we not do that again? That is bad, right? So there's let's put people over, vertically envelop them instead of enveloping them through flanks,
Right.
right? So that's sort of the big idea. Uh, the Soviets and the Germans are pretty well ahead of the United States during the interwar period of this. Soviets particularly, but a lot of these ideas are percolating, throughout the world. The United States sort of gets involved really heavily after the Germans in Operation Mercure, Operation Mercury, when they dropped into sent an airborne unit, the Fallschirmjäger, into Crete, which is interesting because for the Germans, that's like, okay, this is terrible. We're not doing that anymore. We'll
Mm.
use them as sort of elite infantry, but no more of this airborne only stuff. Um, but for the United States, they're like, oh, look at this. Look what we could do. We could, if
Yeah.
we just we could do a little better, we'll be good. And so that from there, a lot of innovation goes into that. In sort of the thinking army at Fort Benning and the Pentagon. And so this guy by the name of Bill Lee, he becomes a major general. He was the commander of the 101st, but has some health issues, and so he does not get to see them take them into combat. But he is sort of the the true patriarch, right? The architect of the airborne, and he gets everything going at Fort Benning with initially, some very small units that grow and grow and grow into by 1942, you have two airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Division. And the 101st actually, they take the 82nd and split it down the middle and then start building from there.
Mm.
And so there's a lot of debate on how they're going to do it. Right, the initial idea, pardon me, is to have two glider regiments and one parachute regiment. Right, and so that's sort of how they train. The idea being that parachute troops can go in first and secure the landing areas. Then you can bring in gliders into other landing areas and then bring in more combat power that way. Um, but as a lot of things in history, it doesn't go that way because when they're getting ready to ship the 82nd over to the Mediterranean, there's uh, not enough room on the boats for
Mm.
two glider regiments and the gliders. So they cut one glider regiment and then add Colonel Gavin's 505th to the 504th, and so then they go with two parachute and one glider, and then ship off to the
Hmm.
war. And then eventually the 101st kind of adopts that model as well.
Yeah. That's interesting. So the ideas of airborne units were actually simmering during World War One. This is something that always fascinates me about World War II and sort of the time period between World War One and World War II is the innovation, like you mentioned, because we did have planes in World War One, but they were very rudimentary. And then by World War II, we have the skies filled with thousands of bombers and jet engine fighter planes and just the advancement, the technological advancement just in that really 30-year period is astronomical and just opens up so many possibilities of um battlefield tactics and warfare tactics, especially with tanks too. I'd really like to do an episode on this one day with Patton and sort of the innovation with tanks, but this is interesting. Um, so they're training, these airborne divisions are created, and they kind of start early on in North Africa, and you mentioned Sicily. But I'd particularly like to talk about D-Day because obviously this is sort of their biggest event, I guess you could call it, in World War II, and one that we see again, harkening back to Band of Brothers. This is a really big moment in the show. Um, so, what was sort of their role on D-Day? Because when we think of D-Day, we think of these guys storming the beaches of Normandy and Saving Private Ryan and everything. But we dropped a ton of guys behind enemy lines in Normandy, which is insane because the rudimentary technology of the time, they have no idea where they landed, where they are in proximity to the enemy, where they are in proximity to their friends and everyone else. What direction they're in. They probably lost equipment on the way down. It's just insane to think that it's 1944 and these guys are jumping out of planes into enemy territory, into battle. Um, so, okay, can you sort of illuminate this story for us. What was their role and their impact at D-Day?
Yeah, so I'll back up a little bit. Um, so coming out of it, end of 1943, right? There's a lot of questions. Eisenhower doesn't like the idea of a division operation. There's a lot of questions, kind of figuring out how he wanted to use them as smaller units. So going in, but that kind of gets overridden. There's some good training and some good new plans coming together and ideas, doctrine, right, to
Mhm.
to mitigate some of the problems that happened specifically at Operation Husky in July 1943 in Sicily. So this gets solved. That's where you see the invasion stripes right on the airplanes, the
Yeah.
three stripes to help prevent fratricide and other stuff. So then planning gets down really in January. General Gavin, who's now the assistant division commander of the 82nd, he gets moved up to England on the planning staff with Ike and everybody, and they start planning the invasion. Well, couple of ideas, before the actual plans finalized, were one of which, and this is from General Marshall, bless his soul. He proposed landing the airborne divisions like basically halfway between Paris and the beaches.
Oh, wow.
Secure an airfield and then bring in another division by airplane, which is like, oh my goodness, that would have been out of control.
It's
So
ambitious.
that fortunately doesn't happen. Yeah, there's a great paper that somebody wrote actually at I think the Command and General Staff College that I found. It's all these like canceled airborne operations in World War II. It was really helpful to help me find sources and just fast. Like they were going to capture Rome. That was a plan. Was to do Rome in '43. But anyway, so that was one plan, and then they start. Okay, let's look at the Normandy beachhead area, right? And how can we use airborne forces to help in this place? And so if you look at the overall picture of all the allies, right? All the beaches. The British are on the far eastern flank, the British airborne forces, and the American airborne forces are on the western flank. The 82nd and the 101st, where they were going to go, the 82nd was going to be even further, west into the Cotentin Peninsula. But once they discovered there's a hill there they wanted them to secure. Once they discovered some of the Germans' anti-airborne, anti-glider defenses, there's this thing called Rommel's asparagus, which is basically telephone
Yeah.
poles,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
To tear the gliders up as they're trying to land, and then what they didn't know is the flooding of the fields. But
Mhm.
so they bring them a little closer in, adjust the drop zones, and the main purpose of all the airborne units is to screen enemy forces. That's the big picture, right? From reinforcing the beachhead. In the American sector, the 82nd and 101st, they're really the 82nd is tasked to secure Saint-Mary-Glisse, which is a critical crossroads, critical town, and it becomes the first French town to be liberated. And then the 101st, one of their main objectives is the La Barquette locks and the lock system that's right in sort of in between kind of Utah and Omaha Beach, to secure that. And then with Saint Mary Glisse, there's two key bridges over the Margaret River that the 82nd is responsible for. And one of which becomes an incredible fight that lasts days at the Lafayette Bridge. And then the 101st, one of the most famous objectives they have is the artillery, right? Breakcore Manor fight that the
Yeah.
Dick Winters earned his DSC there, um, and which is obviously immortalized in episode 2 of Band of Brothers,
Yep.
which everybody loves, which came out like right before. I think it came out like right before 9/11 or right after. I can't remember. So it's like, yeah, it's so intertwined with all anyway. But yeah, so that's sort of the major role of the airborne
Wow.
on D-Day.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, I mean, how did they link up with the forces storming the beaches? Because you gotta think, you have these forces storming the beaches, and then you have the airborne divisions landing behind enemy lines, and you obviously have all these enemy forces in between. So, I mean, what's the process of linking up with the forces?
Yeah, careful using signals, right? Predetermined, right, signals to do so. The first link up was with the 8th Infantry, and oh my gosh, the 101st. I think it was some folks from the 501st, but because they're kind of scattered, right? It wasn't necessarily, supposed to be, but I think that was their sector,
Yeah.
and one of their roles was because that was their other role was to secure the causeways coming off the beach, right? In addition to the locks, and so the 101st and the Fourth Infantry Division are the ones who link up first.
Wow. Huh. So they're quite successful during World War II. They kind of get a lot of they start getting a lot of praise. They kind of make some splashes. And you alluded to this earlier and sort of the media's elevation of these airborne units. Because I really want to speak to this. Because the media is very powerful in creating, uh, you know, making whoever a person, an event, a division bigger than larger than life and really filling the news story, the headline. So what's sort of the media's role in this in elevating these figures to national fame, really?
Right. Well, I mean, part of it is airborne officers just like they kind of capture the imagination, right?
Yeah,
Like just out of just because of what they are, right? Like that
especially in the 1940s.
right. Like most people haven't even flown on an airplane yet, right?
Yeah.
Much less jumped out of it, including some of these guys. But so Jim Gavin, right? He's the youngest division commander of the war. He's pretty good at this. So he jumps on his airplane into Sicily when he's still colonel. Is a Chicago Tribune reporter by the name of John Beaver Thompson. He's called that because he's got this big beard. And there's a couple of photos you could see him because he's got a helmet and everything to protect him, and you could see like this beard. It looks out of place, right, compared to
Yeah.
what soldiers look like in there. So it's really interesting. And so he's just sending back dispatches, right, and and makes them sound very valiant. Specifically, they have a big defense at Piazza Ridge on Sicily. That's pretty famous. Kind of the most important bit of their initial fight in Sicily. But then again, you have reporters that jump with them, and other into Normandy,
Really?
including yeah. Oh my gosh, hold on.
Wow. So you have reporters actually jumping with the airborne divisions?
And so this is terrible. Like I should have this name off the top of my head. But he is involved in Kennedy's inauguration, and I can't remember his name. I have his book. Just a second. Just a second. Here we go. Here's two of them, two of their books. So you got Bill Walton, William Bill Walton, who's involved in the jump in Normandy, and then a guy by the name of Barney Oldfield, right, who ends up in the Air Force when it splits off, is Gavin's division public affairs officer who kind of coordinates this. So Walton jumps in Normandy. He's involved in Normandy. Beaver Thompson's there throughout the war as well. But most importantly, at the end of the war, when everything's kind of ramping down and trying to figure out who's going to be who's going to go home, who's going to be in the parade, how many airborne divisions is the army going to keep after the war. Well, the initial decision comes down that they're going to keep one division. It's going to be the 101st because of Bastogne. And Bastogne
Mm,
was really heavily reported. I mean,
yeah.
you can go in the New York Times archive and see like every day, right? And it's just,
Yeah, the Battle of the
and then
Bulge.
eventually like the headline is like, we didn't need relief, and all that stuff, right?
Ah.
Which it's great. It's wonderful. Um, and Gavin hears about this and he writes to Ike through Ridgway. Ridgway writes, and they're, obviously they're like, no, it should be the 82nd. We've been in combat longer, blah, blah, blah. They compare the records, and on top of that, Oldfield employs all his friends in the media to start writing campaign of letters and stories throughout the newspapers of the United States to kind of, hey, look at the 82nd. They're so good. They're so good. And lo and behold, it's the 82nd. It's not only kept on active duty, but it's selected to march in the Victory Parade in January 1946 in New York City. The ticker tape.
Wow.
The ticker tape parade is the 82nd Airborne Division.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and to top it off, Gavin, for all his greatness, he was also spending time with Martha Gellhorn, a reporter. Spending time like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in his quarters. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so who was the strange wife of Ernest Hemingway?
Oh, wow,
So
really?
so he has a cabal, and Oldfield talks about it in Berlin. basically a cabal, if you will, of reporters that have this club, the press club, and they hang out and they help keep the 82nd on status.
Uh,
So I mean, that's using the information, right? Information
yeah.
operations in this case to keep to take care of your unit. And yeah,
Uh,
so it's a really fascinating little, like, once I started kind of pulling back this, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is out of control.
yeah, that's juicy.
Super fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like, I mean, if you took the divisions, put them side by side, you would say the 82nd has done more
Right.
during this war than it's just, so
Yeah.
there's that too, right? It's not like that was wrong. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
they then employed every asset they had to
yeah.
make it happen.
Yeah, even Ernest Hemingway's wife. Wow, what a crazy tie back to Midnight in Paris and Ernest Hemingway, no?
Exactly.
Wow.
Is Gellhorn in that one? I don't know. Martha Gellhorn,
Maybe, I don't know.
because he's
Who
one
is
of, like,
who
his.
is that?
She was one of his wives. She was in her own right. She was a great journalist. Um, but she's like the fourth. You know what I mean? She's like the
Yeah.
later on. She's
There's
the
all
wife
ki
from
there's all kinds of figures in it, like Picasso's in it and all sorts of artists,
Salvador Dali.
yeah.
Wow.
Huh.
Okay. Yeah. That I need to check that movie out.
It's a phenomenal, beautiful movie, especially, I think Woody Allen. You know
Oh
Woody
yeah.
Allen?
Oh,
I
cool.
think Woody Allen did it, but his movies are a little artsy, but this one's sort of his
Oh, that's great
it's
though. Yeah.
this one's definitely his most mainstream one, but, yeah, it's a fast especially for someone who likes history. Anyway, so the media creates I mean, so the airborne division sort of have this mythos surrounding them coming out of the
Hmm.
war.
Yeah.
Huh. So, I mean
It's not like, yeah. So I kind of characterize it as, like, it's not unfounded, right? But it's
yeah,
it's
yeah, of
certainly
course.
amplified
Yeah. Huh. So they only keep the 82nd,
initially. Yeah.
initially.
And the 11th, sort of. The 11th is in the Pacific Theater. They're an interesting case in and of themselves, right?
Right.
Their commander institutes a program early on where everybody in the glider, they have two glider and one parachute regiment. And he institutes a thing where all the glider folks get airborne jump qualified, and all the parachute folks get glider qualified so they can do whatever needs they need, because the unique circumstances of the Pacific Theater. You're not really going to do a giant, Normandy
Right.
style
Yeah.
operation, varsity style operation. So, but yeah, but then they become uh, the first boots on the ground in Japan for the occupation duty,
Oh,
which is
really?
really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that
So,
is interesting.
in addition to this press campaign that he launches in late 45 after the war, I mean, they do have an outsized reputation, right,
Yeah.
from their conduct in the war. Because it's there's something incredibly daring and fascinating about folks that jump out of airplanes
Hmm.
behind enemy lines. And so, yeah, I don't want to say it, so it's just a media creation, right? That's not the
No, no, for
case.
sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just want to make sure we're kind of nice
Yeah,
and
yeah.
balanced on our
Right.
takes here.
Yeah.
Not too hot takey, right? But anyway, but yeah, so there is this reputation that's then amplified, and then which helps, um, you know, catapult their careers. But on the other hand, too, I will say that you're not going to be an officer in the airborne in World War II if you're a terrible officer. You're not going to last for
For
certain,
sure, yeah.
right? So, like, it's a combination of all these factors, right?
Mhm.
These top performing officers who, if they had stayed in the tanks or whatever, they would have also seen them, seen their stars, if you will, rise.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's and because of that, the airborne units kind of siphon off a lot of talent
Mm.
from the regular infantry divisions. That somebody that might have been a platoon sergeant or something in the 104th,
Mhm.
right, is a corporal in the 101st, right? Just because this is the way it is. So, because you had to take a reduction in rank to go to the airborne in the
Oh.
initial days. Yeah.
Huh.
So anyway.
So, within the Army, sort of the legacy and the carryover and the evolution of Army tactics, would you say that the airborne units sort of changed the nature of warfare? Because when we see World War I to World War II, the nature of warfare is honestly completely changed with the technological advancement of uh, aircraft and bombers and tanks and all these sorts of new things. Now we have airborne units, people jumping out of planes. Um, so did this sort of carry over into the post-war period? Was the mindset of the army, permanently changed because of these new airborne units?
Yeah, I will say, the nature of the war is probably unchanging. Certainly the
Yeah,
character
on
is
on a
is
on a nature of human level for sure.
sure, sure. Yeah, the character of war changes. Yeah, well, because you have airplanes, right? And so, what I find in my research is that now there's this sort of more aerial mindset in the army, right? And the desire to move large quantities of troops by air,
Mm,
because the idea is that in the next war, that the sort of lead up after Pearl Harbor
yeah,
that the United States had before committing troops is it won't be there, and so now we need to maintain, ready troops on standby. Whether they be in Asia or Europe, right, which we had, but also in the ZI, the zone of the interior, the continental United States, maintain ready forces that can get on an airplane and go. Whether or not they parachute, like we talked about a little earlier, is kind of irrelevant here. It's
right.
more so get on the airplane and go.
Yeah,
Maybe they'll parachute, maybe they'll be able to land, but yeah, kind of an air mindedness starts to persist and permeate throughout the army.
yeah. So these guys, you alluded to a few of them, Ridgway, Gavin, and Taylor. They come out of the airborne scene in World War II. Like you said, they sort of get their stars. They're rising up. They're becoming policymakers. What was their role post-war? Um, After sort of evolving from military operations to policymaking.
Right, right, right. So I think so. Yeah. So I follow in my book. I follow three major officers, right? And there's tons of airborne officers that do good stuff. But I think I wanted to. They're sort of the three most significant, and then it kind of gives me this like three main characters, sort of,
Right.
which kind of helps make a story, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so the main the big daddy of them is Matthew Bunker Ridgway, and so he's famous for lots of things, right? He commands the 82nd, and then in the Korean War, he's sort of called in after Walton Walker dies in a tragic accident, and takes charge of the Eighth Army, and then moves up and eventually replaces MacArthur. And he's sort of credited with turning things around in Korea, and at least they puts them on the offensive and then achieve that sort of stalemate that we all know. And then he after that is the chief of staff of the army for 2 years.
Wow.
And while chief of staff, he kind of begins a lot of reforms of changing the army for the idea of nuclear combat. And when he's chief of staff, he brings his protege, kind of Jim Gavin. He brings him into the Pentagon to serve as the Army G3, which is the operations chief, right? Planning operations. And in that role, he's also in charge of research and development. And then Ridgway is replaced by Taylor, Maxwell Davenport Taylor, who is he commands the 101st from Normandy through the end of the war. Before that, he was in the 82nd as the division artillery commander,
Mm,
as a 1 star. And so Taylor, he also is in Korea. He's in charge of West Point right after the war, and he replaces Ridgway as chief of staff. He's chief of staff 55 to 59, and splits. Then Gavin's role kind of splits up where he's only in charge of research and development. And so now these two are really, really shepherding the change to an atomic army, bringing about these strategic response forces, and kind of getting the ball rolling on helicopters,
mm,
and the development of vertical lift technology as
yeah.
well.
Yeah, this is where we start to see sort of the tensions and the clashes between the civilian political leadership and the military leadership. I know Eisenhower um, grew to be in favor of massive nuclear retaliation in case of attack, and these guys were sort of lobbying for these airborne um, divisions to rapidly deploy and be sort of mobile. So can you speak to these sort of civil military relations, these clashes?
Yeah, yeah. It's a super fascinating time.
It is.
And informs a lot of how Civ Mill relations develop. Yeah, so after World War II and the creation of the Department of Defense, you see the creation of the United States Air Force as well, and then with nuclear weapons. By the time Eisenhower is the president, he advocates this policy of massive retaliation. That means prioritizing atomic weapons and the ability to deliver atomic weapons at a sort of global scale. Um, and so the Army's fighting for a role there. Since after Korea in '53, the budget keeps getting cut, 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 personnel cut, 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 and they're like, "What is going on?" And so one of the ways, that they are against this ideas on moral grounds, really, on the idea like
Mm,
you can't just nuke an entire society. That's terrible.
yeah.
Specifically, Ridgway's against it for that. But one of the ways in which they decide to or try to kind of, you know, uh, show their relevance is by developing their own atomic weapons, their own ballistic missiles. One of which is the Jupiter, which is which is what launches the first American in space on a
Yeah,
modified Jupiter rocket, which comes out of the Redstone program and so on.
yeah.
So that's one way, and then they develop a whole ideas of tactics and whatnot to go with that. So, and then other ideas too, be it the strategic response forces and having forces ready to put out brush fires because they figured with all these nuclear weapons, there's going to be sort of small scale conflicts
Mm,
that occur, and by golly, they need to have forces for that.
yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah,
it's really a lot of tension.
it's a little interesting though because Eisenhower was a military man. He's obviously the guy of World War II. He's a five-star general, and now he's having these clashes with the military.
Yeah, well, in a lot of ways, they felt a little betrayed. Like he was
Right,
not
yeah.
only was he in the military, but he was their guy. He was an army guy. He
Yeah.
wasn't an Air Force, and all that. So they're like, "What the heck is going on?" But he was adamant. Ike was adamant that this is the way to save money, and that we would defeat this sort of whole idea of containment. You could not only defeat contain the Soviet Union, and
Yeah,
one way is to sort of to demonstrate that the American way is better,
right.
and didn't want to spend too much money on defense in order to
Mm,
kind of show American prosperity, around the
yeah.
world.
But yeah, he also had his, speaking to the having, nuclear weapon delivery at disposal. He had this Chrome Dome, program. You ever seen Doctor Strangelove?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, classic.
It's
It's
it's so
funny.
good,
Yeah.
so ridiculous, but
Yeah,
also
the
speaks
Chrome
to the moment in a lot of ways too,
right,
right? Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sort of I don't know, maybe the ignorance in a way
yeah,
of the moment,
all of the
Yeah.
above, right?
Yeah.
The sort of societal fear, and anyway, but yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's a good movie.
Yeah, the Chrome Dome's an interesting little slice of history to look into. It's pretty funny. Um, so we have this dawn of the nuclear age that's affecting military operations. You sort of brushed on it a little bit earlier, but can you flesh out exactly what an atomic army is?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in this case, it's the Pentomic Army, right? And it's the Army's attempts to sort of reinvent itself and change itself to be able to fight on a nuclear battlefield where they were project thinking about using nuclear weapons like artillery, and they developed this new unit structure that was five-sided, the Pentomic division. This is where penta, right,
Right, right,
and
right.
atomic. It's a smushed together what
Yeah,
Taylor calls a Madison Avenue word, which is when you think about Mad Men, right, the TV show, which is like set right in the time that this is happening. It
yeah.
all makes too much sense, right?
Uh,
So this idea of creating units that could fight and survive on a nuclear battlefield. The
mm,
idea was to be highly mobile, mass when needed, and then disperse when not needed, so that way you wouldn't present a tempting target for a Soviet tactical nuke. And
mm.
tactical nuke, we can is really a kind of a misnomer, but small, low
Yeah, yeah,
yield
yeah.
nuke.
Yeah.
Because no nuke is tactical; it'd probably escalate to strategic. But they thought maybe we'd be able to fight out with just nukes on the battlefield and not destroy the entire world. which is, now when you kind of think about it, it's like that's
Yeah.
that's cute.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a ridiculous idea. Like I said, the ignorance of the time.
Right, but to speak to that though, the ideas come from their experiences in World War II with airborne units, right? They often commanded up to 5 subordinate units, and they were highly, mobile in some ways, not so much on the ground,
Yeah.
but that sort of span of control was a little bit more normal for these commanders than the rest of the army. But
Yeah.
ultimately, it fails because it's just the equipment. They the ideas were there before the equipment was developed to make it work, and it just fell apart. And so,
Yeah. I mean, sort of what a beautiful tie-in to what we were talking about earlier about history. I mean, what are our decisions but decisions shaped by our experiences? I mean, they were making decisions based on their history, understanding how they got there, who they were. Let's sort of try this out. Okay, that probably doesn't work. Um, I do wanna talk about this, though. We haven't really touched on this. I mean, we sort of talk about the ethos of the airborne, but there are these cultural tenets of exceptionalism, flexibility, adaptability, expeditionary mindset, and decentralization. Can you speak to that?
yeah, so I mean that's it in a nutshell, right? So the idea of like exceptional, that kind of informs everything, right? They just feel like they're better than everybody,
Yeah,
and that for better or worse, right? And then they're not the only unit type in the military, the Marine Corps famously, of course.
yeah,
Fighter pilots kind of feel that way in the Air Force, or maybe in
yeah,
the '50s, maybe it was the bomber pilots,
right.
whatever,
Any
right?
special forces unit, I'm sure, feels
Right,
that way.
and that's a good, and that keeps them alive, right, in
Yeah,
in a lot of ways, and keeps them motivated. And with that, you get like special insignia, special dress.
yeah,
Nowadays it's the maroon beret for the airborne and so on, the jump wings, and these sort of
mm,
things. But the flexibility and adaptability, right? That really comes in a lot. What I see in developing these five-sided unit structures. It's same with the decentralization, because the idea was to have five-sided unit with decentralized company elements,
yeah,
out and about, and that you could call up when you needed to come together, but operating highly decentralized. And you also see that in air mobility and air mobile tactics that are developed with with the famously the First Cavalry Division. Another movie reference. We Were Soldiers, right?
yeah.
We Were Soldiers is essentially the dramatic reenactment of chapter 5 of the book,
Ah,
as I call, or really, chapter 5 of the book is like the academic
right,
going
yeah,
back and finding the real story. But the movie's not far off in a lot of ways. But and then anyway, so you see that there, and then also uh, the expeditionary mindset, right? That
mm,
that really, my primary examples in World War II of that are Salerno and
mhm,
Bastogne.
mhm,
In both cases, airborne units are used as quick reaction forces. In Salerno, they jump, but they jump behind friendly lines, not
mm,
behind enemy lines, right? So the beach is in peril,
yeah,
but there's still a perimeter. And then the 504th is the first to jump on this night, and they're brought in and then pushed up to reinforce. And then in Bastogne, they don't even jump at all, right? And famously, as Band of Brothers, again,
yeah,
another Band of Brothers reference, but
yeah.
that's true. And they go in, and nowadays we might joke that instead of rotary wing helicopter, that's a true. When you go on a truck, it's rotary wheel
Ah,
operations. Ha
yeah,
ha.
yeah,
But or truck assault, or whatever. But
right.
point being, still, regardless of mode of transportation, the they have such an expeditionary mindset that, all right, let's go, and off they go, and they're expected to do that. And then so that leads into the development of the Strategic Army Corps, which to this day is evolved into different names and whatnot, but it still exists, where the 82nd is asked to deploy quickly, at a moment's notice to a hotspot, or to help out, in whatever the case may be. But yeah, those cultural
Yeah,
tenets are a big part of their units today.
yeah. And I think, I mean, maybe I'm sort of a patriotic idealist, but those are also sort of the ideals of our nation. I mean, our country was built on that expeditionary mindset, especially, adaptability. I always people say a lot of times Americans are bad at planning but excellent at adapting. Um,
Right,
we see that
right.
play out a lot. But I mean, this airborne mafia, these guys, they're trying to shift the army strategy towards this flexible response, pentomic army sort of thing. But it's sort of a balance between. I mean, we mentioned earlier that their policies are sort of shaped by their experience in World War II, but it's also shaped by their personalities and these tenets of the airborne divisions.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's where I kind of talked to you about specifically the sort of main leaders of the airborne mafia, but
Yeah,
you're not getting into that unit if you don't already have a mindset of risk taking type behavior,
yeah,
and and or outperforming your peers, and
yeah.
you probably the PT stud that runs up Currahee Mountain on your own just for fun, that kind of thing. Uh, if you've never been there, it's really fascinating. There's a little small museum at the old Camp Toccoa, and the mountain, of course, that's still there, of course.
Huh.
And you could hike it, so that's
Oh
kind of fun.
wow.
But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, no, who they are also informs, and that's kind of speaks to culture broadly. Like
yeah.
culture is just a fascinating topic because it's so amoeba like,
Yeah.
and it's informed by people's personalities, specifically when you're starting a brand new culture, right? Wherever you come from, you bring that with you and you kind of merge it together.
Mhm.
And so you see a lot of that.
Yeah.
See a lot of that there, which is why, starting when you get into the air mobility, what we call now air assault, the 101st. It maintained that's like the next evolution of this culture, just applied to helicopters now instead of
Mm.
jumping out of airplanes.
Yeah.
And it's very specifically because you have airborne officers that are put in charge of those units as well. Hal Moore and Mover Soldiers
Yeah.
was a
It,
paratrooper.
you're so right. Culture is fascinating. It's sort of a big cycle because a lot of people they'll say politics is downstream from culture, right? But also, um, history is sort of downstream from culture in a way. If you look at sort of cultural phenomenon and then you look at 10 years later, the history is sort of shaped by that culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, and how we think about it is shaped by the culture,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
My favorite example of this, and it's historiography, right, which is academic speak, right, not necessarily what everybody's interested in, but it's the history of history. And my favorite example of how this is shaped is re-looking at the American Revolution in the period after Vietnam, and then looking at it more like insurgencies and like that. And so you see scholarship at least that looks at it that way, and it's really fascinating
Huh.
to see that play out. And so and then or now you see a lot of people re-looking at the Indian Wars through, now that Iraq and Afghanistan are over, right? As sort of
Yeah.
similar nation building exercises. Wait a minute, there's some parallels here,
Yeah.
and it gets really fascinating. So anyway,
Huh. No, yeah, I always do sort of draw the parallel between the American Revolution and the Vietnam War and that sort of almost insurgency fight because they're fighting for their ideals, they're fighting for their nation, and they were both underestimated in the end in their resolve to fight. But I also do realize I said that phrase wrong. I said politics is downstream from culture. I meant culture is downstream from politics. I just like to correct,
or maybe not.
or maybe both. Yeah. But I would just
Maybe
like
it's a
to.
feedback loop,
That's what I'm
right?
saying, though. That's the point I was trying to make with the cycle, is it sort of feeds into each other 'cause, culture is downstream from politics, but the culture shapes policymaking in history, so it is that
Right.
sort of
Like
cycle.
you're responding as well as driving.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. No, yeah, culture is one of those topics that like we could get into the weeds. I mean, I
Yeah.
think of, organizational culture is kind of where I think of as opposed to like broad American culture, right?
Right, right, right.
But within any given unit, right, you
Mhm.
have that unit's culture, that company, we'll say. Within that
Yeah,
company, you have non-commissioned officers. They have their own culture. The officers have their own culture, but it's also tied to the other companies in the battalion and the division, and you know what I mean, and the army. But and so it's horizontal, it's
right.
vertical, and it's all sort of woven together to create that company, that platoon,
Yeah,
whatever it is.
exactly.
And so,
Yeah,
anyways,
I mean, speaking to that organizational culture, would you say there's any sort of downsides to this airborne mafia? Was there any sort of like elitism that developed because these guys rise to very high positions, Joint Chiefs of Staff. that sort of things. But they're, they're mafia. They're this tight knit group looking out for each other. Was there sort of an elitism that developed?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, right? Yeah. And so, talking about like the officers after the war, um, they're so, because of their, the airborne is when they started is such a new thing, right? And the
Yeah.
ideal of this idea of being, behind enemy line saboteurs, right, and all that kind of leads to what I see as a little bit of insurgent activity
Mm,
within the Pentagon, right? And
really
so, not like obviously,
treasonous. Yeah.
yeah, not that, but
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
hey, this is our voice needs to be heard, and we,
Right.
like
Exactly. Yeah.
maybe we should change this policy. And so maybe insurgent's the wrong word, but certainly,
Activist, maybe.
yeah, there you go. Certainly like that. And so, but then, so they kind of fall on their sword, right? Ridgway doesn't resign, but he's not renewed, and usually it's a 4-year thing. And he writes a memoir after his service, shortly there, in 1956. I think it's published. He's out in 55, and there's a whole series of articles in the Saturday Evening Post, that he is interviewed about his time in the army, and not and his clashes with the Secretary of Defense and so on and so forth. And then same thing, Gavin retires at 58, writes a book right afterwards, kind of like, hey, this isn't messed up. And then Taylor, of course, in 59. And interestingly, all three of them, their ideas influenced the next president's campaign, whether directly or indirectly, right? The idea of flexible response comes out of Maxwell Taylor's book, The Uncertain Trumpet, which
Mm,
is gifted to candidate Kennedy by General Gavin.
wow.
So yeah, and so yeah, Gavin and Kennedy consult throughout, by letter, nothing super formal, but discuss things throughout his candidacy, the retired Gavin at this point, and yeah, so I wouldn't say it's a downside, but it's an interesting,
Yeah. Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah. For sure. Um, let's dive into Vietnam now because this is pretty interesting. I mean, you have another one of those massive innovations in technological advancement with helicopters, and now necessarily you can move airborne units without parachutes. Um, so how does that? I mean, because that plays a big role in Vietnam, helicopter. Now, how does that change the nature of these airborne divisions?
Well, yeah. So interestingly, so yeah, it's all kind of developed by airborne guys, right, in the 50s and 60s.
Mm,
They're the ones that kind of spur this on. Gavin has a very famous 1954 article titled Cavalry, and I Don't Mean Horses, that kind of gets conversation really going this way. They have to experiment with weapons mounted, like as insurgents on nights and weekends.
yeah.
This is, lower level stuff down at Fort Rucker, now Milville. And because the Air Force, that's the Air Force's ball game, right? And they don't want them. They don't want the Army doing it. And
Yeah.
interestingly, the Navy's like, yeah, we'll help
Oh,
because the other rivalry over there with the Air
yeah.
Force and Navy. And yeah, anyway, it's really fascinating. And then but it's also right. The idea of the way they use these helicopters was supposed to be like the be all end all for this atomic idea, to be able to move units around quickly, and stay away from nuclear weapons. But also they thought, oh, well, maybe in sort of an insurgency or the terrain that we see in Southeast Asia, because they're thinking about Southeast Asia certainly by the early 1960s.
Yeah.
And as France kind of pulls out and the U.S. kind of backfills with advisors and so on,
Right.
as
Right.
that happens. And there's a lot of learning going on. A lot of American pilots over there with early helicopters that are bringing ideas back. But when the test division is stood up at Fort Benning, to really test out these ideas, the command of it is given to Harry W.O. Kennard, Major General now. Well, Colonel Kennard in 1944 December timeframe had suggested to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe uh, to reply to a German surrender request with the word nuts. Like, he is the nuts guy, right? So he's the guy that suggested it. McAuliffe, of course, sends the letter because he's in charge. But Kennard had been his chief of staff. Anyway, so now he's in charge of this air assault, air mobile test unit, and he's bringing a lot of innovative ideas and kind of treating it like the early period of the airborne, and trying to come up with new ideas. and encouraging this sort of this mindset about, whatever you got, let's try it out. And so that kind of leads to the development of those tactics. And I mean, he's firing leg officers in order to hire airborne officers, right? And within his division, right? Because he wants
Wow.
that airborne mentality. He
Yeah, yeah,
wants these people with that mindset.
yeah.
And by the time that unit goes to Vietnam as the First Cavalry Division, the first brigade of that division is still parachute brigade as well. So the parachute, air mobile, both, which is really fascinating. It doesn't last
Mhm.
long because then replacements and everything else can't get the right guys in there. But still, the idea of using these helicopters is tactically very similar to the idea of using parachute troops. It's just now, you have mobility in and around the ground, and you can
Yeah,
now we're going to move everything by helicopter, artillery, and so on and so forth. So that's what you see it in the Idring Valley.
yeah.
Even the artillery had been moved into position to support the helicopter. So anyway,
Wow.
that may not answer your question fully, but
No, yeah, it's beautiful. That is fascinating, the evolution. And now we see where we are today. If you could go back and sit down with Ridgway or Taylor or Gavin or all of them, what sort of conversation would you want to have? What would you want to ask them?
oh my gosh, that's a great question. Wow. I hope you ask all your guests that. I would just want to pick their brains and like,
Yeah,
you know, I want to understand because they're all three interesting, incredibly interesting, important uh thinkers in their own right. Gavin really intrigues me. He's probably one of the most important strategic thinkers in the army that not everyone's heard of,
yeah,
in the 20th century especially. And I just want to just talk to him about a lot of his ideas about where it comes from, pick his brain on all that sort of stuff. Um,
yeah,
he's also like he was orphaned and adopted and then ran away, joined the army, and then was encouraged to go to West Point, right? Like he's just an
wow,
incredible
yeah,
story. And so just talking about all that sort of stuff would be really fascinating.
yeah. Because you can probably imagine that in his mind, he's got these ideas, and he probably had a sort of watershed moment, an enlightening moment in battle or whatever, where he had some sort of experience where that sort of sparked an idea that came to fruition later on. So, I mean, hearing his side of that would be fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then he's also on the top of all that. Seems, from what I can read, the most personable and
Mm,
sort of regular guy of them all, right?
yeah,
And like his dudes to a man would like that served under him said that they'd follow him to the gates of hell and back, right? And
wow,
his funeral was like an incredible moment. His retirement, and he went back to the 82nd at Fort Bragg, and then they did an incredible ceremony for that. And he's just one of those beloved guys that he kind of maybe fell from grace after his the 50s, but
yeah. Are any of them buried at Arlington?
uh Gavin's at West Point.
Uh,
I don't know, maybe Taylor.
that would be
I don't know
interesting.
where Ridgeway is. He might be at West Point too, but I did stop by his grave. Him and one of his subordinates that was with him in a lot of positions is right next to him. Jack Norton, who was an important air assault guy later too.
Yeah,
Um, but they're buried next to each other. So
yeah,
that was I was up there for research, and I had to stop by. Right.
yeah. I was actually in Newburgh, New York, 2 weeks ago, which is 20 miles downriver or downriver, upriver, whatever from West Point. Because it was my
That's where the
aunt lives.
bridge is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. My aunt lives there, and she was a tour guide at George Washington's headquarters in Newburgh, which was the headquarters that he was at the longest during the war. So during President's Day, they have a Washington and Martha, actors who play the part. And I went to go visit. Obviously, I love history, so we went and did that, which was actually incredible because we're having this discussion right now. If you could go back and maybe meet your heroes or talk to your heroes or someone that you've studied, what would you say? And that it's an actor and this is all sort of trivial, but he stepped out in his full, general attire, this tall, towering figure. He's got this deep, commanding voice. Like the actor plays, he's like one of the best, supposedly, like
That's awesome.
in the country. I mean, he plays the part so well. He's like he knows everything about Washington himself. As he's like a historian about it. He's got like the most accurate uniform. He's got the voice, and he talks like it's 18th century, and everyone refers to him as the general around. So when he walks out, I ask questions about history, for this podcast, like, that's what I do, and I was completely, like, sort of starstruck and dumbfounded. I was, like, rendered speechless by him. I was like, "Holy," like, that is George Washington, like, what do I do with my hands?
Even though it's
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
It was sort of a surreal feeling that put this, because I do ask this question to all my guests, sort of in a broader sense. I ask, what 3 historical figures in general would you wanna meet? Um, and, you always talk about, but I was like, I I I didn't even know what to say, but then I was there for a couple hours hanging out, and then I talked to him and asked him some questions, and he answers like it's George. It's pretty fascinating, but yeah, yeah, it was
That's
it
cool.
was
Yeah, Newburgh.
fascinating.
That's also where the Interstate 84 goes across right there too. I think that's where one of the big bridges is. Because my wife's from Connecticut, so we'd go through
Yeah,
the
there was a
area.
big bridge, and then we also went to, Hyde Park, which is obviously FDR's presidential library and
Yeah, I would
hideout.
like to go there someday.
Yeah, and
I didn't
then
make it there.
the coolest part, aside from Washington, was the Vanderbilt mansion. There's a Vanderbilt mansion there,
Mm,
and it is
cool.
insane. That's the first time I've ever been to, like, a really, old sort of mansion, like, from the Gilded Age, and it was insane. The intricacy and the grandioseness of everything on the inside, I'm like, "Dude, like, it
What are you
it
doing?
it didn't feel real," and it was literally a seasonal vacation home for these people. I'm
I
thinking,
know, right? Like, what is going on?
God, yeah, it's
Yeah,
crazy.
I went to Germany this last summer and went to Charlottenburg Palace, which, man, talk about
Yeah, I'm
ornate.
sure the ones in Europe just completely destroy anything American.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was, I think, built in 1699 it was started. So it's older, obviously, but I mean, the art, I mean,
Yeah,
it's just fascinating. I
like
think Napoleon stopped
Versailles.
in there or something. I don't remember.
Really? Oh, man,
Yeah, it was cool.
that is cool.
Anyway,
Yeah, well, Rob, I mean, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking. Thank you for shedding light on the airborne divisions. Thank you for the work you're doing, writing these stories, educating people, and thanks for coming on the show.
yeah, I'm trying to do a little. I don't know if you're gonna have the whole YouTube up there, but a little shameless
Yeah, I
plug.
will. I will. I'll have it linked down in the description below. Don't you worry about it.
Okay, cool.
So people can go to Amazon and check that out. I can have your website linked down there too. So
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So I gotta update that at some point. It's kind of a mess right now, but yeah, you know how that goes. It's
right,
yeah.
right.
If it ain't one thing, it's another.
Yeah.
But no, I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I look forward to seeing what it sounds like. I probably won't listen, to be honest with you, but
Yeah. Well,
I'll
we we
trust
we had it. It's our lived experience.